Welcome to The Health Edge, translating the science of self-care. I am Mark Pettis, and I'm with my friend, colleague, John Bagnulo. John, good morning, my friend.
Good morning, Mark. It's great to see you, buddy.
Great to see you as well in this beautiful fall season that we're in right now, and good to just be connecting, John, and sharing the
Yeah.
science that we love. And our podcast, as we sort of resurrect some of what we've been doing from a recent hiatus, often focus around a paper, something that gets our attention. And a research paper that we've been looking at is one that I think is really aligned with many of the principles that we've discussed in the past, John, around nutrition, that focuses more on moderation of carbohydrate and liberalization of healthy sources of fat and protein. And in this particular study that we're going to look at, this was not designed to be a ketogenic trial. This isn't very low carbohydrate ketogenic. This was just moderation, low carbohydrate. And a small number of men, these were adult men who, none of whom had diabetes, but many of whom had obesity and fatty liver, which we've talked about, fatty liver being a really important attribute of metabolic syndrome and disrupted metabolic health and insulin resistance. And so this study just took a small group of men and randomized them. One group got very low carb, high fat. The other group got what we would consider sort of the standard American diet. They got much more carbohydrate, about 55%, typical of the standard American diet, with lower fat and moderate protein. And calorically, they were the same, so it's not like one diet had fewer calories than the other. And in just a matter of days, right, 4 or 5 days, as we'll show, John, they showed very striking differences. So I'm going to share my screen and just pull up this paper. And this was published recently. This is a group from Denmark. And this is from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And looking at the impact of short-term, again, this was just a matter of days, eucaloric, meaning equal caloric intake of both a low and a high carbohydrate diet on these men that had liver fat. Liver triacylglycerol is fatty liver. This is accumulation of fat in the liver that is associated with insulin resistance and obesity. And as we've talked about often, John, this is epidemic. This is a huge, huge issue. Some might say that it's public health enemy number one. And just very briefly, just so people have a sense of how this study was designed, John, they were all on a sort of a standard American diet. And then they get baseline testing, and you and I will talk about the testing that was done here. And then they're put on either a high carbohydrate, low fat diet. This has been really the standard of nutritional recommendation for, to me, John, it feels like forever, at least for the last couple generations, or they got a low carb, high fat diet, and again, equal amount of calories. And then they were retested. And then the beauty of this, with a small study, is they then sort of wash out all of the participants, go back on sort of a standard American diet, and then they repeat the study where the prior group that had high carb then goes to the low carb side. So this is a study where you get crossover, and so very powerful and important data that emerges from that. And then I'll just jump to the conclusions here, John, and then I'll pause and let you weigh in. The low carb diet reduced the fat content in the liver by 35%. These are really pronounced changes, again, over 4 to 5 days.
Yeah.
Whereas there was no change in the high carbohydrate diet. And again, they saw this with the crossover. So those that benefited when they then were switched to the high carb, low fat, lost those changes. And those that had no change initially on the high carb, low fat had significant changes when they were introduced to the low carb. So that crossover design is very affirming. As we might predict on the low carb, there was much better burning of fat, this fat oxidation, right? This is the holy grail of what we would consider metabolic flexibility, the ability to quickly burn fat as a fuel. The beta-hydroxybutyrate, even though this was not designed to be a ketogenic diet, they were producing more ketones in the low carb. And not surprisingly, their blood triglycerides went down, their insulin concentrations, which you and I might consider one of the most predictive blood markers today, went down, and the ability for the liver to manage glucose, what we would consider insulin sensitivity, improved. So these were all sort of global, dramatic metabolic improvements over just a matter of days that were confirmed in the crossover. Yeah. So these aren't the studies, right, John, that make headline news, but they offer affirmation and mechanistic evidence that is really quite striking when you look at how quickly the body can adapt to these changes.
Yeah, I mean, if this study doesn't pique your curiosity about just how dynamic really the effects are of shifting those macronutrient levels around, then I don't know if anything would pique a person's curiosity, because, as you're saying, 4 or 5 days is that's remarkable. And I think how profound the effects are. In addition to that, just noticing, first of all, you already highlighted it, what an epidemic. We used to call it non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Now they had to, it's always telling, right, when you have to rename a condition because of how prevalent it is and what an epidemic. So now it's metabolic associated liver disease, but it's the same thing that for 30 years was called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And, their numbers vary, but estimates are, anywhere from 1/3 to 45% of people over the age of 40 have fatty liver deposits because their livers are basically drowning in carbohydrates. And that's the best way I could really summarize it, is that the liver has a finite capacity with which it can, safely process these surges in blood sugar levels. And, you end up with these high triglyceride levels, which is, again, I don't want to digress here, but I think it's the one lipid that tells us the most about a person's health is triglycerides, not cholesterol and not the different fractions of cholesterol, maybe small dense LDLs, but those usually go hand in hand with high triglycerides. But, you've just got this really remarkable turnaround in liver health overall. And, using triglyceride levels as a surrogate for that, you could also look at fibrosis. And, it's astounding. And it, reminds me of a paper that was a little different, but showed a similar turnaround in 10 days. It's around 20 years old now, by Ian Frassetto. And in those subjects, and there was, again, it was a small pilot study similar to this, where the subjects were put on a Paleolithic diet. And in 10 days, their fasting insulin levels went from 32 to, under 10. They didn't look at everything that was looked at here in this Danish population, but it was also an incredibly fast turnaround in the health of those that were following this Paleolithic diet. Now, this is, again, not so much paleo. This is really focused on the levels of fat and carbohydrates. And when you look at those, first of all, to your point, well constructed study in terms of that there were no differences in the calorie intake, because that's one thing that's always, anytime a high fat diet has, slightly less calories than some of the other studies, that's what's nitpicked by the critics, right? They're saying, well, there was a difference in your ketogenic population or your low fat, population. They had significantly, different calorie levels. And so then everything is, kind of discredited. So here the researchers made sure that the caloric intake was the same. The protein was actually very similar. I was surprised that the high carb group was able to consume 133 grams of protein. I found that really, really interesting. So they did a great job in terms of, having this be, limiting the moving parts here, right, to the carbohydrate and fat levels in each of these populations. And, again, 4 or 5 days to see that type of turnaround in liver health, it speaks to how resilient the human body and human physiology really is. The other thing that I find interesting that, I know I mentioned to you earlier was that, the total cholesterol levels, they rose slightly in the lower carb, high fat group. And so it shows me how useless that is when you have a reduction in body weight, you have a reduction in triglycerides, your liver is getting better, you're burning more fat at any given intensity. And yet, because your cholesterol levels rise or your LDL levels rise, again, all that is thrown out and it can be deemed as an unhealthy diet. It really shows you, I think, and speaks to the overall lack of efficacy in terms of using that lipid as an evaluation for where someone's health is or how effective a dietary intervention is. So a lot of things we could talk about with this study, but I think the real headline here is like, wow, in just a few days, someone can really turn things around dramatically. And yet, again, it's like you said, unfortunately, this isn't what receives the headlines. We don't have enough people seeing this paper.
Yeah, for sure, John. And the extent to which these metabolic markers, as we've talked about often in the past, be it the amount of fat in the liver, be it your insulin levels, your glucose levels over time. They also gave these participants continuous glucose monitors, which I thought was pretty cool. So they had some sort of real-time data while they were on these dietary interventions. But anyone who's ever worn a continuous glucose monitor would be equally amazed at the rapidity with which the peaks, these excursions, which may be the most telling in terms of long-term risk, are dramatically reduced and stabilized. And as we've often talked about, John, while this, it's compelling enough when you look at the prevalence, as you talked about, of insulin resistance, right? 35 to 40%, that might be conservative with pre-diabetes. Another, 10, 12%, and that may be conservative with type 2 diabetes. And I say conservative because these definitions really look at glucose only, or hemoglobin A1C as a time average measure of glucose, as the, that it's defined by that. And yet, as we've always talked about, you'll see rises in insulin long before you see rises in glucose. So if we were to reestablish the diagnostic guidelines for prediabetes and diabetes to focus more on insulin, you'd see much higher prevalence of both prediabetes and diabetes. So I think we would all agree that these are huge public health matters. And then when you sort of extrapolate that, so yeah, it's fantastic. You can lose weight and drop your sugar and have these. You would definitely drop your blood pressure, though that wasn't the focus of this study.
Right.
Your lipids. The long-term game, right? The long game that we're all interested in is that these metabolic measures are one of the strongest predictors of all chronic complex disease risk over a
Yeah.
lifetime. So wouldn't it be remarkable if in a very short time, a matter of days to weeks, you could reduce your Alzheimer's risk, with a huge magnitude of reduction? You could reduce your cancer risk. We know so many
Yeah.
cancers are manifestations of insulin resistance, from breast to colon to pancreatic, and
Yeah.
so this global chronic complex disease risk reduction, improvement in health span, quality of life, compressing morbidity. All of these things can be extrapolated from what this study is pointing out in a way that no other medication on the market, no other lifestyle intervention. Exercise is the holy grail, and when you combine dietary principles like this with lots of movement and some, as you would say, time under the load, resistance, you are really profoundly changing the cards that you're holding. So this is a short-term study that I believe would predict in the long term profound changes in one's health trajectory, quality of life, and possibly longevity. And that's an even bigger headline. And as we always talk about, John, it really does require for the individual a greater level of discernment when attempting to reconcile recommendations or guidelines, or maybe advice they are being given by their primary care doc or their endocrinologist or cardiologist, with where the evidence is at today and where it continues to pivot and shift, and that distinction for the consumer is huge. While for the establishment, those experts, it can take some time before these things translate. And so that to me is also the message here, John. As a consumer, you really have to take matters into your own hands often when it comes to your health, because some of this advice, what we're talking about, won't readily be forthcoming.
Yeah, I mean, that's an understatement. You really have to, I think, for, in so many areas of health, medicine, stay curious, and always appreciate the difference between outcomes and maybe a biomarker that doesn't necessarily equate to a different outcome. And I think that a study like this should pique our curiosity, to say the least. And again, what's this, about a year or two old now? I think it was January of 24. So
exactly.
So I mean, I'd be curious to see if these investigators are going to do something on a broader scale that may at some point receive more attention or a headline. But I think stay curious, and again, always appreciate that if, in a study like this, if the subjects are losing weight, burning more fat, their liver health is improving, you have to take those things as outcomes, right? You're changing the outcome, you're changing the trajectory of a population's of their health, their life. And so if you put this in comparison to a study that examines a high fat, and there's a lot of these studies now that are very myopic. They're going to look at one biomarker that may not translate to an improved outcome or health. But so again, we could pick on total cholesterol. That's something that's often investigated, and it's misinterpreted, as you and I have spoken to. I think the microbiome is another area where I repeatedly see it's pointed out that a high fat, low carb diet undermines the microbiome. And that, again, that's, in my opinion, the investigators are first of all, the high fat, low carb diets are often made with all the wrong types of fats, right? And they're void of any fiber. And there, there's no life rafts for the microbiome, so to speak. And even then, though, even in studies where maybe everything is misconstructed in that comparison and it's unhealthy, what you notice is that the families of bacteria that are investigated or looked at in the microbiome don't necessarily translate to a better microbiome, right? So I just think that there's so many misconstructed comparisons between high fat or high carb and the other. And I think that what's remarkable about this study is not just a 4 or 5 day turnaround time for improved health, but it's you're improving outcomes. You're actually changing organ health. You're getting the types of changes that we want on the broader, big population type level.
Yeah, those are such great points, John, and it made me think of when you look at the explosion of GLP-1
Yeah.
agonists and the combined GLP, GIP, gastrointestinal peptide, these very effective small molecules. Sometimes I worry that once there's a pharmacologic answer,
Yeah.
that it makes sort of what one might otherwise be trying to promote in terms of non-pharmacologic interventions a bit of a harder sell.
Mm-hmm.
And while the researchers here didn't measure this, my speculation is that you would have found significant changes in the GLP-1 production of the biome in the gut of participants on the lower carb, higher fat. And we know that more protein and more fat can be important attributes to enhance endogenous production of GLP-1, which is why those macronutrient proportions are more satiating, and people often do consume fewer calories.
Right.
And as you pointed out, John, often that is considered the reason why somebody might lose weight. And it's a reason, but it's when you look at the global sort of metabolic improvements, I think that it's a reminder for me that there are many natural, if you will, ways to enhance one's own GLP-1. The whole microbiome story here, John, which is so fascinating and still really kind of a black box, I think is a big one for further exploration. I meet a lot of people on GLP-1s, and it's changed their lives, and there's a lot to be said for that. There are some people who are just in free fall and need to gain traction. But when you look at the opportunity to develop a really thoughtful lifestyle, holistic, integrated health program in conjunction with what might be a GLP-1 intervention, it's the long game, right? Of eventually you got to come off these meds. We know how to put people on meds. We really have very little insight as to how to get people off these meds, and we know that they can be problematic long term. So all of that is to say that for me, these are powerful strategies to offer in conjunction with pharmacologic interventions that could allow people to get off these medications more quickly, or maybe to find a lower maintenance dose that they can coexist with fewer side effects. And so, the body's pretty much designed to do so much more than what any drug generally can do for us. But I do worry sometimes, John, that once there's an easy pharmacologic answer, that again, all of the sort of passion for lifestyle and healthy food and really getting into what's happening, what's really going on, and how can I assume more effective sort of oversight of that, gets further marginalized. And I don't know. We'll see how things play out. But for me, this is should be required consideration in anyone thinking about a GLP-1.
Yeah, to your point, Mark, it's triage, and I understand that there's a need for people to sometimes, use a pharmacological intervention short term to get the traction. I think the concerns, just to kind of add to what you were articulating, is that you could go on a GLP-1 program. Long term, though, it doesn't necessarily equate to being nourished and to receiving all the different micronutrients and even more importantly, macronutrient distributions that would be ideal for a person physiologically. So you could go on a GLP-1 program and after several weeks, respond favorably with respect to your weight, but are you consuming a biologically appropriate, array of foods? And the answer is clearly no. That's why there's this explosion of GLP-1 diets and foods to be used in conjunction, right? I mean, and a lot of these are, again, they're a step in the right direction. They're offering a GLP-1 user more fiber, more protein, things to really help with the gut, because we know that a lot of people suffer there. But the high-fat diet, and I hate to limit it to that description. When you just say high-fat diet, automatically there's connotations for what that looks like, and you lose I'm going to say you lose over half of your listeners, not our listeners, because our listeners wouldn't be here if they weren't interested in this. But if you talk to the average person and you say high-fat diet, they immediately think, well, that just can't be good. Like that's bad. But the high-fat diet is biologically compatible with human physiology. And that's, there's unequivocal evidence of that from, look at the digestive tract, look at our requirements. And, what was great about this, and I'll leave it at that, is that the high fat, lower carbohydrate participants consumed about 160 grams of protein per day, which is what I know you and I would recommend for the average adult. Not the World Health Organization recommendation of 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. That leaves you with sarcopenia as an outcome. And a lot of GLP-1 users are starting to exhibit sarcopenia, right? They're just not getting everything they need. They're turning off their appetite. And I understand that there's some rewards to that short term, but long term, you're going to end up with a different set of issues. Osteopenia, osteoporosis, sarcopenia. But yet, if you eat this way, and again, maybe GLP-1 is a stepping stone for people to get there. But if you eat this way, you get the protein you need, you get the essential fatty acids you need, you support cellular physiology, you support your mitochondria, and you do it all non-pharmacologically. You do it all with what I think is a really well-balanced construct. So, yeah, just to add to what you said, I think GLP-1 gets people some traction, but it should not be looked at as like the long-term answer.
That is a really good point to close on, John. Nice discussion, and
yeah, it's fun.
I certainly would for people who might be new to the Health Edge, our website, thehealthedgepodcast.com, has a lot of I think great content on there, our older interviews, some great research papers, and so for anyone who might be interested in a bit more deep dive about low carbohydrate, higher fat. If you have concerns about your lipids, your cholesterol, your LDL, we address a lot of that. That almost inevitably brings you to questions around statins. Do I take it or not? We address a lot of these issues, and they're not black and white. There are many shades of gray, as we know, but it's a different context for how to think about one's health, because what we're trying to offer is a roadmap that's more empowering and helps the individual realize that they're much more powerful than they may perceive themselves to be. And as this study illustrated, one can begin to realize that in very short order. So please check that out for those who want to take a deeper dive. And And John, I know we talked about our next topic of looking
Yeah.
at the biome and this interesting molecule, urolithin
Yeah.
A, and that sort of family of small molecules. And
Yeah, everybody's excited about ellagic acid, and you and I have talked about it in the past. I mean, it's an amazing phytonutrient, but emerging science would suggest that not everybody can use that ellagic acid the way they would hope. And so I think it'd be a really cool discussion about how the microbiome has such a strong influence over what we do with phytonutrients.
Great. Well, we will have fun with that
For
deep
sure.
dive. And John, great to see you as always.
Great to see you, man.
Enjoy this weekend coming up, and look forward to connecting very soon.
Same here, bro. Take care.